So homework 28 is starting out with factoring. The first thing they're going to do is do the greatest common factor. Greatest common factor is asking, what can I divide out of both terms? What do they have in common? Well, if I look at my numbers 7 and 10, their only common factor is 1, because they're only both divisible by 1. They don't have anything else in common. When I look at my variables, a y squared and a y third, y squared means I have y times y to the third means I have y times y, so they've got 2 of them in common, a y squared. So my greatest common factor would be 1y squared or just y squared. General rule, when you're doing the greatest common factor and you're looking at your variable, you always take out the lower exponent. That would be what's common to both. So if I'm finding the greatest common factor of 10x and 8x squared, 10 and 8's greatest common factor would be 2. If I have an x and an x squared, the greatest common factor is just an x. They both have one x in common. So 2x would be my greatest common factor of 10x and 8x squared. My greatest common factor of 20w squared and 25n to the fourth is just going to be a 5. 20 and 25, their greatest common factor is 5. The w squared and the n to the fourth don't have anything in common. They're 2 different variables. So just the 5. Once you do the shorter ones, then they're going to get into a little bit longer ones on the next 3. So number 4, I'm finding my greatest common factor of 2w to the fourth, v to the fifth, x to the seventh, and 22w to the third, v to the fifth. My greatest common factor of 2 and 22 is 2. If I have a w to the fourth and a w to the third, I would have w to the third. I've got a v to the fifth and a v to the fifth. So those are both in common. And I have an x to the seventh here, but I don't have any x's in there, so I don't have a common x. So I just have 2w to the third, v to the fifth. So my lower exponent on each of my variables. So my greatest common factor of 16y to the fifth, u to the eighth, and 28y to the sixth, u to the third, x to the second would be
4y to the fifth, u to the third.
4y to the fifth and u to the third. And again, no x's since that's not common to both. So number 6, if I'm finding my greatest common factor of 14w to the 7th y squared and 21w to the 8th v y to the 6th.
7w to the 7th, y to the 6th.
7w to the 7th and y to the 2nd. So my greatest common factor of 14 and 21 is 7. Here I had a w to the 7th and a w to the 8th. I used the lower one, w to the 7th, a y squared and a y to the 6th. So I use my lower one, the y squared, and I don't have v's in both, so I don't use any v's. So the reason they have you pick out the greatest common factor is they're going to give you expressions and tell you to factor them. When it says factor, you're trying to figure out, well, what times what gives me this answer? So the first thing you look for is there a greatest common factor? And you're going to put that out in front. 16n squared minus 12n to the third would have a greatest common factor of
4n to the second.
4n to the second. So I'm going to write that in front. I'm then going to put parentheses, and I'm going to divide each of those 2 terms by that factor. So I'm dividing my coefficient and subtracting my exponents. So 16n squared divided by 4n squared
4.
is just a 4. And if you took this times this, you should end up with that first term. Negative 12n to the third divided by 4n squared.
Negative 3n.
Negative 3n. Again, if you take this times this, you should get that, which you do. So negative 12 divided by 4 is negative 3. 3 minus 2 is 1, so n to the first. If I'm going to factor 15w to the third plus 20x, my greatest common factor there is
5.
just a 5. They don't have any variable that's in common, so all I'm going to do there is divide each of those terms by 5. 15w to the third divided by 5 would be
3w to the third.
3w to the third, so that this times this gives me that. And 20x divided by 5,
Plus 4x.
a positive 4x. So that this times this gives me this, which it does. Number 9 there. If I have 12a to the 4th minus 23a squared, their greatest common factor is 1 a squared. So just an a squared, right? So a squared would go out in front because that's the only thing I can divide out of both of those. 12a to the 4th divided by an a squared would be
12a squared.
12a squared, because 4 minus 2 is 2. And then negative 23a squared divided by a squared, just the minus 23. So if I took a squared times 12a squared, I get 12a to the 4th. And a squared times negative 23, I get negative 23a squared, which I do. Number 10, and probably the rest of the page, is all going to be factoring by grouping. You do factoring by grouping when you have 4 or more terms. We're just going to do it with 4 terms in different variations. Sometimes you need to rearrange them. Sometimes you can just leave them in the order that they're in. But what you're looking for is you want to pair up things that have something in common. I'm just going to start with the first one and group the first 2 together. If I take x to the 3rd minus 4x squared, those 2 terms have a greatest common factor of x squared. So if I divide the x squared out of each of those, x to the 3rd divided by x squared leaves me just an x. Negative 4x squared divided by x squared leaves me just the minus 4. So when I do my other 2 terms, what I want to have happen is I want to get the exact same thing in the parentheses. If I have negative 5x plus 20, but I want to end up with a positive x, what do I have to divide out of my negative 5x? The negative 5, right? If I divide each of those by negative 5 then, negative 5x divided by negative 5 leaves me a positive x. 20 divided by negative 5 is negative 4. So you can see that what's in the parentheses is the exact same thing, and that's what you want to have happen. If that doesn't happen, you want to rearrange your terms and try it again. We're not done yet with the problem. What happens is now this becomes my greatest common factor. The x minus 4 is going to go in front, and I'm going to divide that out of both of my terms, which just leaves me those things in the front. X squared minus 5. So my answer is that I'm going to have x minus 4 times x squared minus 5. If I wanted to check my answer, I could FOIL that out. X times x squared is x to the 3rd. X times a minus 5 is a minus 5x. Negative 4 times x squared is a negative 4x squared. Negative 4 times negative 5 is positive 20. I should get the same 4 terms, not necessarily in the same order, but I can check and say, oh yeah, that works out. I got the right terms. So if I'm going to factor by grouping, I usually look and say, oh, do the first terms just have something in common? If they do, I just leave those 2 together. If they don't, then I start trying to rearrange things. So in this case, I'm going to start with my 4y to the 5th plus my 5y to the 3rd, and I'm going to look and say, what do those both have in common? They both have a y to the 3rd that I can take out, right? So I'm going to take out the y to the 3rd. Trying to remember which one of these I had to fix because there was a typo on it. So if you see one of these and you have a different problem than I do, it's probably because it didn't work out right and I had to fix it. So if I take out a y to the 3rd from 4y to the 5th, I would get
4y to the 2nd.
4y to the 2nd. If I take y to the 3rd out of positive 5y to the 3rd, I would get
5.
A plus 5. So my goal on my other 2 terms is to end up with a positive 4y squared plus 5. I have negative 24y squared minus 30. So what do I have to divide negative 24y squared by to get a positive 4y squared? Negative 6. So negative 24y squared divided by negative 6 is positive 4y squared. Negative 30 divided by negative 6 is positive 5. Those two things match up, so we know we're on the right track. My common factor then is the 4y squared plus 5. If I factor that out of each of my terms, I'm going to get the values that I factored in front, so the other factor is going to be y to the third minus 6. And that crazy thing's going to go in for my answer. Again, if you want to FOIL it out, you should end up with those same 4 terms you started with. If you're on the assessment and you go, I really want to check, make sure it's right before I type it in. Number 12 then. I have a 2y to the third minus a y squared. Those both have what in common?
Y to the second.
Y to the second. And if I factor a y to the second out of each of those, I'm going to get
2y
2y minus 1. Now notice here I have 2y minus 1. What do I need to divide out of 2y to get 2y? See, I put this one on here for a reason. What do you divide 2y by to get 2y?
1.
A positive 1, exactly. So I'm going to have a plus 1 in front, and if, of course, I divide both of those by 1, I get the same thing. So if that happens, where you have what you have in the parentheses, you still have to factor the 1 out. My common factor then is 2y minus 1. My other factor would be the y squared plus a 1. So number 13 there, now they've messed the order all around and did all that fun stuff there. And so what I like to do when they don't have it in order, highest exponent down, is I like to start with the one with the highest exponent. So I'm going to put the 2w squared, and then I'm going to pick out which one of those 3 terms that I have left have the most in common with my 2w squared. A negative 12w would be a good choice. So I'm going to work with those two. Start with those as my first 2. So out of those 2, I can divide them both by 2 and a w. I'm going to divide them both by a 2w. So 2w squared divided by 2w would be?
W minus 6.
Okay, just a w, and negative 12w divided by 2w is minus 6. So 2w times w minus 6. So now when I'm looking at the other 2 terms, I know that I want to get w minus 6, which means that the term with the w in has to go first, right? So I'm going to have my plus wy and my minus 6y, and I'm going to say, okay, what do I need to divide out of my wy to get just the plain w?
Y.
The y, and it's going to be a positive y because I need my sign there. And so if I divide them both by positive y, I'm going to get the w here and the minus 6 there, right? So what we want to have happen is have, excuse me, the same thing in both sets of my parentheses, which I do. So w minus 6 is my common factor. Canceling those out. My other factor going to be the 2w plus the y then. And again, if you wanted to check that, you could FOIL it out. You should get those same 4 terms. So number 14, which 2 terms should we start with? Which 2 terms would be good ones to group together?
4u squared and plus 20u.
4u squared plus the 20u. I always like to start with the one with the highest exponent and put it with the one that has the most in common, but I better put my u behind there. So 4u squared and 20u, both are divisible by?
2 in u.
Bigger than 2? 4 in u, right? 4 would be my greatest common factor, so 4u. If I divide the 4u out of both of those, I get
U plus 5.
u plus 5. So again, on my other two terms, I know I want the one with the u first. So the minus uv with the minus 5v. I want to end up with a positive u, so what do I need to divide out of my negative uv? Not just the v, but also the negative v, because my sign's got to change, right? So negative divided by a negative gives me a positive u, and here a negative divided by a negative is going to give me that positive 5 that I want to get. So I get u plus 5 in both of them, which is what I want to have. So u plus 5 is my first factor, and my other factor would be 4u minus v. And one last one of those, factoring by grouping. Which two should we start with?
2u squared minus 14u.
2u squared minus 14u, and both of those are divisible by 2u. So if I divide 2u out of each of those, I'm going to get u minus 7. So again, on my other two terms, I want the one with the u first. So I have uy minus 7y. And if I want to get a u, I'm going to divide out
Y.
a y. And it's going to be a positive y, because I don't want my signs to change. And so if I divide out the y, we get u minus 7. So my factors are going to be
U minus 7, 2u minus 5.
u minus 7 times 2u plus y. And if you start out one way and you're not getting it to match up, just rearrange and put two different terms together. Sometimes there's more than one way that it works out. You just want to make sure when you start with your first two terms, they've got something in common, so you've got something to factor out of both of them. All right.